Hello and welcome to Matrix Live. Today my guest is Josh, the new MD of the Matrix.org Foundation. As a disclaimer, because we are going to talk about a quite sensitive topic, I'm an Element employee, but all my time is dedicated to the foundation. But I want to be completely clear that I'm hired by Element. Recently, Element has announced that they were forking one of the most popular home server implementation, Synapse, and they would release it under a dual license, including the Agpl v3. This is significant news, so let's cover the implications of all that. Josh, hello, welcome. Can you tell us more about the situation prior to this fork? So Synapse is a foundation project and it's open source, so Element can't just take over it like that.
Right. So Synapse is indeed a project that was assigned to the foundation, and I think we should also note that Dendrite is also sort of part of the conversation here. The decision's been made to fork that as well. Synapse and Dendrite both being home server implementations that were that actually predate Element itself, but stewardship and development on those projects happened at Element. In 2019, Element assigned the copyrights to those projects to the foundation, to the extent that they had copyrights on those. And at that point, those projects were hosted by the foundation, right? We provided both infrastructure in the form of the GitHub organization and repositories, as well as communications infrastructure on matrix.org server. Those are things that we provided for those projects, but maintenance and development of those projects continued to come primarily from Element. So what's important to note is that while these projects have been under the auspices of the foundation has only had a role in providing them home, not in furthering development on them. The foundation, if anybody has caught our multiple appeals for support and fundraising, you might not be surprised to know that the foundation doesn't have the resources to drive development of these projects.
All right, so the new fork of Element is going to be released under a dual license. Well, at least it's going to be released under the Agpl v3 and something else. So in your CV, you have a very interesting step. You were the president of the open source initiative, so let's try not to get too excited over the licenses, but I think it's important to stop for a minute on everything intellectual property and licenses. So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when somebody is writing code and publishing it, publishing the code is not enough to allow others to use the code. As somebody who has written the code, I still own the intellectual property of the code I wrote. And if I contribute to a project, even if it's not my project, I still have the intellectual property of the fixes or the features I have contributed to the upstream. So without a license, nobody is allowed to use someone else's intellectual property, and a license is a standard way to give explicit permission to use my intellectual property under specific conditions that are detailed in the license, the type of license I'm choosing. And because I retain the intellectual property of my contributions, the upstream project that I'm contributing to cannot unilaterally decide to change the license under which the project is released. So the question, the thing that is not necessarily clear is, can Element unilaterally decide to switch the license of its fork, which contains all the past community contribution? Can they decide to switch that to Agpl v3?
Right. So I think there's a little, there's some context I need to set here. So I will say now that I might need you to remind me of the exact question, because the context is quite significant. First, the disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. And if you have any serious interest in intellectual property, for instance, if you're building a business on it, consult a lawyer. So don't take my word for these things. But it is true, I spent 6 years at the Open Source Initiative, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about licenses and hanging out with lawyers. So to that extent, I'm happy to provide what understanding I do have. So first, that's the first disclaimer. One more disclaimer. The reality of copyright is that it is different all over the world. And yes, there are some treaties to normalize it across some number of nation states, but the reality is that it's complicated. And indeed, beyond the patchwork of copyright regimes across the globe, there's also the question of what are your contractual obligations? And that varies by locale and by employer, indeed. So, for instance, some people, if you are contributing while working for employer X, that you might have an employment contract that says anything you do, they have the copyright on. Some jurisdictions allow that, some don't. So, uh, so not only am I not your lawyer, not only does this vary across the globe, but also it varies by your employment contract or the contracts that you are bound to more generally. So uh, there's a lot of scope for this to, there's no universal answer here. But on the whole, yes, I think you've roughly got it just about right. So when I am uh, engaging in any creative pursuit, whether that is writing a poem or writing code, ultimately, I have the copyright for that as the author, right? And so if I want to contribute some code that I have written to an open source project, by default, the sort of the default state of affairs is that though I may contribute it to that project, and that project may have the expectation that you are licensing it to us under, for instance, the Apache v2 license, um, I still hold the copyright to that. So that means that as the copyright holder to that contribution, yes, I have licensed it to that project under whatever OSI approved license it is that they use, but I also maintain by merit of maintaining the copyright, I can also do whatever I want with that. I can license it a different way to somebody else. I can use it any way that I want to because again, that is something that I have ownership of. Now that changes in some situations. There are some projects where there's a requirement for copyright to be assigned, or if not to be assigned, to be licensed to this other project or organization, which would give them the ability to make decisions with the code that they might not otherwise have the legal standing to do. So, to your question about can Element do this? Well, yes, Element can do this, right? So the facts on the ground are that the projects, both Synapse and Dendrite, are under the Apache v2 license, which is considered is not only an OSI approved open source license, but it is considered a permissive license, right? Like the MIT or the BSD license. These are a class of licenses that, yes, it both gives the downstream user rights and responsibilities, but broadly permissive licenses have less in regard to responsibilities that they place on the downstream users. So in this case, while Element had assigned the copyrights to these projects to the foundation back in 2019, and while Element had also licensed, assigned the copyright to all of its contributions to those projects to the foundation, folks who read my introductory blog post most fairly recently will know that individuals who contributed to these projects outside of Element retained their own copyright. So what this means, sometimes you'll hear people talk about shared or distributed copyright in an open source project. And this is more or less the situation that we had with both Synapse and Dendrite, where there were hundreds of people in addition to the foundation itself, that owned copyrights in the projects Synapse and Dendrite. And all of those, though, were ultimately placed under the Apache v2 license. So, in terms of what is allowed with these projects, what can be done with these projects, anything that's under an Apache license can be incorporated into proprietary code, can be forked, can be sublicensed, can be lots of things. It doesn't actually matter who holds all the copyrights to some extent, because the Apache license offers so many rights to the downstream users, and including the rights to license it differently, with the obligation to preserve some notices and things like that. Again, talk to a lawyer if this really matters to what you're doing. So yes, Element has the standing that it needs to fork these projects, to choose to license them differently. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that they have all the ownership, all the copyrights, right? But it does mean they can choose to fork it and start licensing it differently. So indeed, that is what they have chosen to do.
Right. So if I want to summarize a little what you have said, everybody is keeping their copyright. So the copyright of Synapse and Dendrite is distributed among the foundation. Probably not Element, because it has decided to give away its intellectual property to the foundation. But all the contributors remain, keep their copyright, but because of the Apache 2.0 license, this allows Element to basically use the contributions and relicense them, because the Apache license is very permissive, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's basically the sum of it.
All right, so the Apache license may be permissive, but there is one license that is a bit less permissive, and it's the Agpl v3, which can be considered spooky by a few lawyers. So since the new license is Agpl v3, if I contribute to Element's fork, I keep my copyright, and they can't make a dual licensing with that, can they?
Well, it depends, right? So one of the things that has been discussed is how Element will receive net new contributions to their forks on these projects. And indeed, they have chosen to move forward with the AGPL v3 license, which is depending on where you sit, it is more free, or it can be treated as a bit of a poison pill. But ultimately, the AGPL is a reciprocal license, right? So we have the spectrum from permissive licenses to reciprocal licenses. And reciprocal licenses, for instance, include the responsibility to make any modifications that you make to that software available under the same license, and indeed make the source code available to any downstream user. So if you were to contribute to the forks of these projects, Elements forks of these projects, my understanding is that they are going to require those contributions to be under the AGPL v3 license. And I believe there is also discussion of a contributor license agreement that they would put in place. And a contributor license agreement is one of those things that, like so much in open source, is a dangerously overloaded term. I want to be really clear that a contributor license agreement can mean and do a lot of different things. So make sure when discussions of CLAs come up that you know what kind of CLA we're talking about, because they are not all the same. But one of the things that some types of CLAs do is they involve either an assignment of copyright, right? Either you are giving up your rights, your copyright in a given contribution, or you are giving them greater permission to relicense, redistribute. They can make additional decisions with that contribution. And now there are CLAs that do neither of those things. So again, look into the details, and critically in this case, we don't actually know exactly what contributor license agreement element is going to be using on these projects. So we cannot say with certainty what that arrangement is going to look like for any given contributor until we have more information on that front.
All right. So everything, licenses, CLAs, etc., everything legalese can be quite complicated. Just want to make a note. It just occurred to me that I've read those terms recently in a book that is not published yet, by Vicky Brasser. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. The book name is Business Success with Open Source. I believe that should be approximately the name of the book. So it's going to be released soon, I believe, and it contains a lot of information about open source, licenses, intellectual properties, policies, CLAs, etc. It's very dense, it's very information packed. So if you're into setting up a business that depends on open source, that uses open source or releases open source, I recommend you to have a read.
Yes.
Anyway, that was the license bit of the episode. The next question is the foundation going to keep maintaining its own branch of Synapse, the one that Element is forking?
Right. So the foundation has not at any point really seriously engaged in the maintenance or development of these projects. One might analogize that to the relationship of many open source foundations to the projects that they provide a home for. Foundations, in many cases, the relationship with a given project is one of two things. It is either this is a project we provide a home for, a neutral home for, and we maybe provide it with some infrastructure and resources. The other type of arrangement you might think of more like the Python Software Foundation and its relationship to Python itself, or CPython, right, which is a absolutely fundamental piece of the Python ecosystem. And so the Python Software Foundation has projects that it just hosts and provides support for. The Python Software Foundation also has projects that it actually helps channel resources to make sure that there is continued development. And indeed, on those types of projects, they also have sort of governance mechanisms in place for how those projects are stewarded on an ongoing basis. So it's really important, I think, here to look at other open source foundations and how they function, because it helps us to parse what exactly is going on here. And in the case of the Matrix.org Foundation, these were projects that, yes, they are the most popular server implementations for Matrix. There's no doubt about that. However, they are only projects that we supported but did not maintain and develop. They are effectively, from the Foundation's perspective, not quite as core to our mission. The thing that is core to the Foundation's mission is the spec, right? And this is where not only does the Foundation have a role in supporting the spec core team and facilitating the continued evolution of the spec, but also the Foundation has a role in governing the spec, whereas that was not the case with Synapse and Dendrite. And so the Foundation at this point is in a position where we can't do much. We really don't have a lot of options at this point. On the one hand, anybody could choose to fork these Apache licensed projects. Literally anybody could do that. You could do that. And there's nothing stopping people from doing that. And then also on the question of, do we continue investing in these things? There's should we and can we? Um, and in terms of what the foundation should do, the foundation's view basically is that we are here to support the ecosystem as a sort of neutral custodian of Matrix. And in that world, it does make sense for the foundation to engage in some level of research, development, and maintenance of open source projects. Yes, the foundation does have a role there. But that role, I would argue, is one of filling gaps, of addressing the things that the rest of the ecosystem is struggling to address. And for instance, trust and safety is a known pain point, right, on any decentralized network, and Matrix is no exception. And so to that end, the foundation has been actively pursuing grants to further the development of open source moderation tooling for use on the Matrix network. But there is not a gap being opened on home server implementations. Indeed, Synapse and Dendrite remain, even the forked versions of them remain under open source licenses and will be actively maintained. There's not a gap being opened there. And even beyond Synapse and Dendrite, we have other servers like Conduit that are being developed by other people in the ecosystem. And so in terms of what does the foundation do with the Synapse and Dendrite projects, we wish the forks well, and then we get to the question of what can we do, and given the resources or lack thereof, we cannot afford to start maintaining and developing these projects, and so we won't. But that doesn't mean that someone else can't, right? Again, anybody could fork these projects. And if somebody wanted to get together a team and start putting in the god awful amount of time and resources that it takes to maintain such projects, they could do that. But the foundation can't afford to.
Right. So my key takeaway from that is, on one hand, the foundation doesn't necessarily have the resources to do it, and on another hand, the foundation doesn't necessarily even want to do it. Well, at least the current position of the foundation is that it doesn't think it's its role. This could change maybe with the governing board. We are going to have elections for the governing board soon. And the members of the governing board could have a say in that strategy,
Yes.
maybe. So shameless plug, if you are an individual or an organization and you are interested in participating to the governance of Matrix, please reach out. We are going to leave links in the description. You should become a member and you will have say in what the foundation is doing. Back to Synapse, I was thinking of a sort of lazy way for the foundation to do things. Since Element is releasing its Synapse fork under the Agpl v3 license, which is an open source license, can't just the foundation rebase its branch of Synapse on top of Element's changes?
They are open source. Yeah, I mean, and indeed, one of the questions that we're still sorting through is what do we do with the repositories that remain under the Matrix Foundation's auspices, right? So we're not taking the repositories down, right? We want to make sure that the source code remains available to people, and we want to minimize breakage. It is entirely possible for the foundation to ultimately treat its current repositories, change the way that it treats its current repositories to treat them as downstream of the forks that Element is making, such that one could get the most up-to-date versions of those from the foundation. Now, we don't know whether we're going to do that yet. Honestly, there are lots of logistical considerations that we're still hashing through. So could we? Yes. Will we? Remains to be seen.
All right, makes sense. So I want to. We have been talking about Synapse. There is a sort of little thing next to Synapse, which is Synapse modules. And
Right.
one thing that is particular with the Agpl license is it's sometimes called the viral license by some lawyers, because when a modified version is used to provide a service over a network, the complete source code of the modified version must be made available. So the one question is, does that mean if I have written a proprietary Synapse module, do I need to release it as well?
Ah, well, I can't answer that question. Um, so this is one of the things that it is true. One of the things with the AGPL is that it has requirements to distribute modifications or make source code available when it is when the software is providing something over a network connection. And it basically, the AGPL is an evolution of the GPL that was designed specifically in view for in view of the way that now much of the way we consume software or use software is through a browser or network services, right? Um, it is not clear to me where that bright line is. Um, there are questions. There are, I have seen intellectual property attorneys argue this every which way. And so there's a lot of space for argument here. Reasonable people can disagree. Um, and then there's also the question of what is your risk tolerance, right? In terms of how you want to interpret the licenses here. Um, I think it's worth noting that Linux itself is under a reciprocal license, not AGPL, but it is GPL licensed. Um, and there are still many pieces of software that are used on top of Linux, for instance, in user space, that are licensed completely differently. And there are lots of applications that we might use in that context without thinking that, oh, because Linux is licensed this way, everything is licensed this way. So this is a murky and complicated space. And I can't provide a clean answer as to whether an individual who would use or make modifications to Synapse module would have obligations to then make that source code available.
Right. There is in the AGPL this concept of aggregate. This is something that people maybe would be interested into looking at. And as usual, I am not a lawyer. You are not a lawyer. We are not your lawyer. So if you are in that area, seek legal advice. And yeah, as often the AGPL can be interpreted in different ways. So
Yes.
we can't give a definite answer here.
Yeah, and one piece of context that I think is really important to provide here is that unless you are an organization building on open source software, you probably don't need to worry too much about many of these things, right? Um, if you're building a business, well, then of course you're going to be worried about these things, and you should absolutely think through these things and maybe agonize about them a little bit to make sure that you're doing everything above board in a way that's not creating risks for your business at the very core of it. But for individuals, this is not going to make a very big difference.
Right. All right. Another question we have, because we had a lot of very interesting discussions and passionate discussions following the announcement. So that there was this question that the foundation doesn't have enough resources to take over Synapse maintenance and maybe doesn't even want to. What about some other more fundamental projects, like, for example, the Rust SDK or libelm, which contains the cryptography bits? What if Element, which is the major contributor here again, what if Element decided to stop contributing overnight or could not afford to contribute? Because it's not necessarily that Element doesn't want to, but it can also be that Element can't do it anymore.
Sure.
So what would happen?
Yeah. So in that case, we would have to ask the same questions about what can the foundation do, what should the foundation do, and um, and to your point earlier, the current stance of the foundation is one thing. We are bound by the corporate governance, the corporate law in the UK, which is where the foundation is incorporated. We're also bound by the rules of the foundation, our articles of association, and a few other sort of key governing documents. Um, and of course, at the center of all that is our mission. And so there are some things about the foundation that are unlikely to change because that is literally codified in the law and in the rules that govern us. But the question of what can and what should the foundation do, that is something that can change, right? So again, back to your point earlier, as we go to elect the first governing board next, somewhere in the timeline of April to June next year, that governing board does get to weigh in on the direction of the foundation and the way we use resources and what initiatives we take on. And so for people who care very much about what the foundation does, that is your opportunity to weigh in, right? Anybody who is a member of the foundation has the right to stand for election and be seated on that governing board and then be part of those conversations. So I say all that to highlight that this is the current stance of the foundation, given where we are now. And this is absolutely decisions that we make in view of all of the feedback that we're getting from other people in the ecosystem. We are not acting unilaterally, but it is also true that we don't yet have a governing board to formalize that community feedback and representation. So what if Element stops contributing to one of these other core projects? To that question, the foundation would have to reflect on what do we have the resources for and what does the ecosystem need? And right now, we have come to the conclusion that the ecosystem needs help when it comes to trust and safety. And if, for instance, we were to find that there are key pieces of technology that that stop receiving support, whether that's from Element with one of those projects or another company with other projects that are core to the Matrix ecosystem, we would have to say, okay, that is going to create a gap in the ecosystem that is going to matter for all of us. And so if there is a gap left in the ecosystem, then yes, it is our role to find a way to, even if we don't have the resources yet, to find the resources, to channel the resources, or to cajole other people into becoming the stewards of those projects. So, the Rust SDK and libelm, as you've mentioned, if we saw those projects fall into stagnation, right, if they were going unmaintained, they are so core to the ecosystem that we would have to seriously think about how do we fill that gap. Now, if there were other implementations of those libraries, then those versions going into disrepair or going stagnant may not actually be a problem, right? Because there would be other alternatives that were still valid. But absent a world where there are options, that can be equivalent in their functionality, such a gap would be left. Yeah, the foundation would have to figure that out. We would have to make sure that those things continue being maintained for the benefit of the whole ecosystem.
All right. So it sounds to me that a lot of the issues we are seeing right now seems to stem from the fact that Element was a bit too generous, maybe without realizing it, giving away all of its property, intellectual property, to the foundation. And without necessarily creating all the proper governance or creating a ground where others can come and contribute. Will this event introduce governance changes, like, for example, to decide what a project needs to do or to have or to provide, for example, a proper governance or at least two organizations contributing to it before it can join the Matrix org namespace?
Right. So yeah, I think. Well, first I want to address the generosity note, because I think that's important context. That, as I said earlier, Synapse predates not only the foundation, but it predates Element. And in fact, the people who lead Element are the people who founded Matrix in the first place, right? So there's a reason that they have made the decision uh, to be generous, right, with the time, with Element's time, in creating more open source software for the benefit of the greater Matrix ecosystem, right? They are invested not only as people who run Element, but as people who started Matrix in the first place, in our collective success. And I have to say, to their credit, again, in my intro blog post, there are a lot of decisions that they have made that have made life harder for them. They were the right decisions to make for the benefit of the ecosystem, but decisions that definitely made things harder on Element itself. You look at other companies that have been founded around open source projects like Mongo. They have made very different decisions to take their projects completely out of the open source commons, right? And even before they decided to relicense Mongo under the server-side public license, they had certainly never created a nonprofit foundation to steward the project, right? So, like, Element is just one player in this ecosystem, but it's also very important to know that Element is the one, the founders of Matrix are the people who decided to put in the resources to create a foundation in the first place, in the hope that we can build something that's bigger than any one organization, any one open source project. So I think that's really important historical context for all of this. It's easy to see the spat of companies relicensing projects and to project that onto what we're seeing happen here. But there are very substantial material differences in what is playing out here. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So with all that background said, Tim, could you remind me of the question?
Yeah, the question was, will we see some governance changes in what is required from a project so it can make it under the Matrix Foundation umbrella?
Right. Probably yes. So one of the things that I spoke about a little bit earlier is the way that open source foundations provide a home for projects in different ways, right? There is a sense of being a host, a home for projects, and then there's a sense of, oh no, this project is actually core to the foundation's responsibilities, and it has to actually develop the project on an ongoing basis. So if we think about Synapse, Synapse fell into that first bucket where it is only being hosted by the foundation. And sometimes we call that arrangement fiscal sponsorship is sort of the technical legal term for it. Often you hear it being referred to as like being the umbrella organization for a project. And the reality is the foundation is, though it was founded 4 years ago now, or established, I think actually 5 years ago, but really began operationalizing in 2019, the foundation is still nascent, right? It's still early days. I'm literally the first person that the foundation pays to staff it, right? Like, yeah, you're paid by Element and you're seconded to the foundation, so you work full time in service to the foundation. Um, but I'm the first employee of the foundation itself, right? And that's like a really important milestone in the journey of any nonprofit in open source or otherwise. And so the reason that I set that context is plainly there's a lot of work the foundation needs to do in setting policies and building governance for how we would handle projects like this in the future. So if you look at other foundations, many other foundations have this notion of um, like an incubator, right? Like you must apply to become a project that is hosted with this foundation, and and if you meet the criteria and you get approved, then you are then in the incubator or this sort of trial phase of being hosted by that foundation. And then there are often criteria for graduating, right? Okay, great. Your project has been accepted to be hosted by this foundation on a trial basis. Uh, Congratulations, you've been successful so far. You're meeting this additional criteria, and now this project is a full-fledged member of the foundation. Um, so there's sort of like the entry requirements, then there's sort of the graduation requirements, and then because many open source projects have a natural life cycle that includes deprecation sometimes, um, there's also this notion of, I think with the ASF, they call it their attic, right? Some places elsewhere call it their archive. And so say a project is being deprecated, it might then be, uh, mothballed or archived or put in the attic in that way. So all this is to illustrate the way that foundations typically engage with open source projects that seek to join them. And when Synapse was assigned to the foundation, we did not have that framework. And indeed, to this day, we do not have that framework yet. So yes, I would expect that the foundation, especially once we have a governing board seated, um, will do some serious introspection and also research what else is, what other foundations do, and then consult with other stakeholders in the ecosystem to define a policy framework by which we would say, here's the way to apply to join the foundation. Here is the way to become a full-fledged member of the foundation. Um, and here's what's entailed in that, right? Because, for instance, with Synapse, we provided some community infrastructure and some technical infrastructure, but we didn't provide them with legal, right? We didn't provide them with financial resources. And sometimes foundations do that, right? So um, there's both the question of what is the framework for accepting projects, and then there's also questions around what do we actually provide to those projects. And so we would need to explore both of those things. And I think that this is definitely one of those moments that's going to make us think really hard about that.
Right. So this is there will probably be governance change, but it's not up to you, I, or Matthew, or Element, or whoever to decide. It's going to be up to the governing board to take a final decision that can still be revisited eventually in a next meeting. This brings me to the next question. Right now, Element, being one of the largest contributor to the foundation, creates a sort of power imbalance that the governing board is meant to change. So can the individual contributors and organizations in the ecosystem do something, first to get a voice to the chapter, and second to give the foundation more power?
Yes. So the first most important thing that I would recommend is paying attention to the membership program, right? So we are recruiting. We've been recruiting institutional members to our membership program, right? Who will then have the opportunity to be elected to the governing board. We are also, as Tip, you and I have both been assessing CRMs and the tooling that's going to be necessary for us to actually establish formally the individual membership of the foundation so that we can then run elections and communicate and all that good stuff. So for organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, public sector, and otherwise, they should look at our membership program and get involved. There are multiple tiers of membership, and the silver membership tier is very accessible for organizations. The costs are not the costs are manageable, um, and by joining as an individual or as a silver member or gold or platinum member, the organization then is doing two things. One, it is getting itself representation through the governing board. But the organization is then also critically putting funds into the foundation, and that's also very important because right now the foundation operates. The foundation has 3 corporate members, and we have several hundred individual donors whom we will work to confer officially individual member status on. Um, that still does not add up to paying all of our bills, frankly, right? Even operating the matrix.org home server um, is a significant cost center for the foundation, and we do not yet have the resources to fully cover it, which means that we are operating on the good graces of Element, who has been donating a lot of this for years. And so for those who are interested in seeing the foundation become more representative, have to see it actualize diverse community governance at multiple layers. The key to getting there right now honestly comes down to funding, right? Because if the foundation can't pay its own bills, then we leave a vacuum that anybody could fill. So I would highly encourage people to get involved, to donate. If your employer uses Matrix or has a program by which you sponsor open source projects, even ones that you don't use, donate to the matrix.org Foundation so that we can actualize not just diverse community governance at multiple layers, but just be truly independent and self-sustaining, because until we are self-sustaining, we will find imbalances in the ecosystem.
All right, and just one thing I want to make very clear is that it's not a pay to play. It's not the more you give, the more voices you get. You have been mentioning the different tiers. We have individual, silver, etc., up to platinum. A platinum member is not going to get a stronger voice than an individual representative.
Right, absolutely. I mean, look, if you squint, I mean, it would not be unreasonable to call this pay to play, right? Because even for the individual members right now, there's an ask of paying at this level to then be conferred status as an individual member. But critically, platinum members don't get more voices, right? We are very deliberate in how the governing board is going to be composed so that we're not privileging, we're not overly privileging those with the resources. And so critically, I want to note that there are things that we're looking to though it has already been thoughtfully designed, the governing board, there are already some improvements that we want to make to it. For instance, we want to make it possible for individual members to get that status even if they don't have the financial wherewithal to do it, right? So if you have been contributing to Matrix code bases or documentation or running events, well, that's worth something. That's a contribution that ought to be recognized with individual member status. And so that's one thing that we'll be figuring out. Another thing that we will be figuring out is how to make sure that other open source foundations and indeed projects in the Matrix ecosystem are also represented on that governing board. So I want to be clear that the governing board is already, as designed and implemented, set up to make sure that that we're not giving undue influence to any one player. There is still room for improvement, and we're already looking at that because we really want to make sure that this is truly representative of the Matrix ecosystem.
Right. And the membership program is not the only way the foundation is going to try to raise money. So we are going to run several fundraising campaigns. But for that, before that, I would even say, we owe some transparency regarding what we plan to do with the money and what we have done with the
Yes.
money. So I don't want to spoil things too much, but we are putting the final touches on a roadmap that we want to make public as soon as the Foundation Guardians have approved it. And there will be a financial report, I believe, that will be published as soon as it's ready, but it's going to take a bit more time, I believe, to put together before it can be released. Anyway, is there anything we forgot to mention in the episode?
I think what I would like to leave people with is the impression that and an understanding that this is an evolving situation, that we are figuring this out. We're figuring this out together. There are rooms that we have established where you can jump in and ask questions and provide feedback to help us figure out how we chart our course forward. Um, this is something that's a fluid situation, and we're trying to figure it out. We don't have all the answers. And so I would encourage people who are invested to make their voices heard. If you go to the contact page on the matrix.org website, you can find some ways to reach us. And I will say also that we are, to Tibbs' point, we are working on increasing transparency, and will be not only sharing about what the foundation actually does. Turns out the foundation does a lot with a small amount of resources, and so we want to make that visible so that we can make collective decisions about, is that the right thing for us to be doing, right? Should we do more of one thing and less of the other? Well, as we begin publishing that, we can make those decisions together. And indeed, not only will we be publishing about the actual activities of the foundation, yeah, just like any other nonprofit, we owe the world transparency and financial reports. And so those are things that we will also be working toward. And in the meantime, if people have questions about things, I welcome those questions. We're going to answer them ultimately as a matter of course through process, because that's the right thing to do for any project and foundation. But we're not going to gatekeep answers in the meantime. If you want to know, come ask, because I'll give you those answers. The most important thing to remember is that the beating heart of the Matrix ecosystem is the spec, and the spec remains under an open source license and under open governance. And so while that is the beating heart of the ecosystem, and that remains under the purview of the Matrix.org Foundation, and that will not change, the ecosystem is still bigger than any one project or two projects. So this is a challenging, complex time for us to figure our way through. But again, this is all much bigger than the projects in question here, and we're going to be okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Josh. I believe it's time to wrap up. It's been quite a information-packed episode. I'm going to leave a link in the description of the video for people who want to come reach out to us. So the room we usually hang out in is the office of the Matrix.org Foundation. So link in the description if you want to join, ask questions. On that note, I want to thank everybody in the Matrix community who has been joining us. Sometimes the conversations have been heated, but the discourse always remains civil. All the questions were interesting and it was not derailed. So thank you very much for everybody who have contributed so far. I hope this episode answers a few of your questions. If not, well, please come and ask questions. And I'll see you next week. See you around Matrix Live.